The chain still had her ankle when I got the blade free. Not a real chain, twine, old rope gone stiff with rain, doubled and tripled till it held like iron. Whoever tied it knew knots. I had to work the axe handle under the loop and twist, and even then it didn't give clean. It pulled at the skin of her ankle and she made no sound. That was the first thing I noticed. She'd stopped making sounds a while back. Her hands hung loose, wrists above her head, lashed to a branch maybe 8 feet up, and the rain had been coming down for 2 hours and she'd stopped making sounds. The tree had a sign nailed to it, hand-lettered on a shake of cedar, which, one word, capital letters, somebody'd taken their time with the nail placement. I cut her down anyway. That was the fall of 1889. I was 43 years old and I had not done a gentle thing in 6 or 7 years, maybe longer. I ran a timber crew out of a camp in the foothills east of the Cascades, 18 men, crosscut saws, a pair of draft horses named Grant and Sherman after the generals, and a cook named Foss who was missing 2 fingers on his right hand and blamed it on a different person every time you asked. I kept order with my size more than anything else. I am 6 feet 4 inches, and at 43 I was not yet running to fat. Men looked at me and decided things weren't worth the trouble, and that was mostly enough. I was not a cruel man, I want to say that up front. But I had gotten hard in the way that happens when you spend years at work that punishes softness, around men who read softness as weakness, and the hardness had crept in without me noticing. The way sap creeps into a log in winter, slow and cold, and then it's just part of the grain. You don't notice the day the grain changes. You look down one morning and the wood is different and you can't say when it happened. My wife had died in 1883. Fever. We'd been married 4 years and had no children, and her name was Ruth, and I don't talk about her much. I'll say this, she was good and she was gone before I understood what I had, and the understanding came too late to do anything with. I kept that understanding in a room inside me and mostly kept the door shut, because walking past it was one thing and opening it was another thing entirely. What I mean is, I was the kind of man who walks past things. I'd learned to walk past things, not out of callousness, out of the same instinct that makes you step over a loose board on a bridge, careful of your weight, not wanting to go through. The tree stopped me. I was riding back from Dalton. That was the nearest town of any size, 12 miles down the valley, where I'd gone to settle an account at the supply house and argue about a shipment of saw chain they'd shorted me. It was October, late afternoon turning toward evening, the light already going flat and gray, and the rain had come in off the mountains about 2 hours earlier, the cold kind, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there. My horse was unhappy about it. He had opinions about the rain, that horse. He walked with his ears back and his head low, which was how he registered protest. I heard her before I saw her. Not crying, she was past that. More like the sound a wounded animal makes when it's still alive but not trying to escape anymore. Low, irregular, coming from the tree line on the east side of the road, 15, 20 yards in through the brush. I could have ridden past. I'm not sure why I didn't. I've thought about it more times than I can count. There was nothing in my immediate interest that said stop. There was everything in my habits that said keep riding. It's wet. It's getting dark. You don't know what's in those trees. Your camp is 4 miles north, and the trail gets worse in the dark. I was tired. My back hurt. The account at the supply house had gone badly enough that I was in the specific bad humor of a man who's been argued at by someone smaller than him who is also in the right. But I stopped. I suppose the sound was just too particular. There's something in the sound of a person who stopped fighting that gets past the part of the brain that makes reasonable decisions, gets past it straight down to some older place. I don't know. I stopped the horse, sat a moment, listened. It came again, lower than before. I tied the horse to a branch and took my axe from the saddle, not because I expected trouble, because an axe is a useful thing, and I've carried one since I was 17, and pushed through the brush. The lightning tree had been dead a season or two. It had that particular gray, naked look, bark gone, branches stripped, the top shattered where the strike had come down. Big tree, probably fir. The sign was nailed at eye level, which, cedar shake, like I said, black iron nail, not rusted, so not old. She was alive. That was the most I could say with certainty. Her wrists were lashed to a branch about 8 feet up with the doubled and tripled rope I mentioned, and her feet weren't quite on the ground. She was on her toes, and even that much support had let her hold on longer than she would have without it. Her head was down. Her hair was loose and soaked flat against her face. I put the axe to the rope, and 4 swings cleared enough of it that she came down. I caught her. She was not a large woman, compact, and the weight of wet clothes and wet hair added to her, but not so much that I couldn't manage. I carried her to the base of the tree and set her down against the trunk, out of the worst of the rain, and looked at her. Her face was bruised along the left side. 3 marks on her cheekbone from fingernails, going the wrong direction to be her own. Her wrists were the color of old liver from the blood being stopped. The rope had cut in. I took the remaining loop of rope from her ankle. Her eyes opened, brown and sharp, sharper than I expected given the state of her. She looked at me without saying anything. I said, "I'm going to get you out of here." She looked at me a little longer, like she was making some determination. Then she nodded once. That was enough for me. Getting her on my horse was awkward. She couldn't grip much with her hands, and the horse was still registering his opinions about the weather, and I am large enough that helping someone small onto a horse requires more coordination than it sounds. But she was game about it. She didn't protest, didn't make a fuss, and when I had her up she sat straight and held the pommel with her wrists rather than her palms, because that was what she had. I walked the horse. It was 4 miles to camp, and I walked them. By the 2nd mile the rain had led up to a drizzle. She was upright the whole way. I could hear her breathing, and it was steadier now than when I'd found her, and once or twice she made a sound that wasn't pain, almost a sigh, like something releasing. I didn't ask her anything. Seemed like not the time. Camp came into view around a curve in the trail. The cook fire first, orange through the trees. Then the tents, the horses' shelter, the mess. A couple of the men were outside, and I heard one of them say something to another, and then they went quiet. Foss met us at the edge of camp. He'd seen everything from a distance, and in his 7 years with me, he developed the useful habit of not asking questions until he had more information. He took one look at the woman on my horse and said, "Hell." Which was about right. "Cook tent," I said, "stove going." "I'll get it hot," he said, and went. Her name was Nora Voss. We learned that later. That first night she didn't say much of anything. We got her into the cook's tent, warmest spot in camp. That's where the stove was, and Foss heated water and found a spare wool blanket and didn't ask me questions I didn't have answers to. I'd known Foss long enough that he understood there were situations where the most useful thing you could do was move quietly and not make the air heavier. The men stood at a distance and watched. Most of them were good men, rough, not educated, but not mean. I told them to go to bed, and they looked at each other, and most of them did. Her wrists were the immediate problem. Not broken, but the skin was open in places and the swelling was bad, and the cold had done its own work on top of that. I had some strips of canvas we used for blisters and a tin of pine pitch salve, and I cleaned the skin as best I could and wrapped them. She watched me do it with eyes that were present but not quite all the way there. Present the way a woman is present who is managing herself carefully, not letting herself feel everything at once because she doesn't know yet whether it's safe to. I said, "I'm Hale, Emmett Hale. You're in a logging camp about 4 miles north of the Dalton Road. You're safe here." She looked at me steadily. "I know what a logging camp is," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges from whatever it had gone rough from, being outside in the rain maybe, or before that. "My father worked timber." "Where?" Oregon coast, Tillamook. Long way from here. Yes, she said. I finished wrapping. The canvas wasn't proper bandaging, but it would hold through the night. Is there someone I should send word to? She thought about that. No, she said, there's no one. She said it without self-pity, just a fact. All right, I said, sleep if you can, you're in no danger here. She looked at the tent walls, at the stove, at the blanket across her lap. Something shifted in her face, not breakdown, not tears. More like the relief that happens when you've been holding your breath for so long you've forgotten you were holding it, and you finally breathe. Thank you, she said. I slept outside the tent. It wasn't chivalry exactly. It was that I didn't know where else to put myself. There's a thing about this valley I should tell you. By 1889, the valley had been settled for about 15 years, and in that time it had developed the particular psychology of a place that's still not entirely sure it's going to make it. The winters came off the mountains with no apology. The summers ran hot and dry, and the risk of fire was something you lived with from June to October, not as an abstract concern, but as a specific, daily weight. The soil along the river bottoms was good but not deep, and you could lose a year's work to a July frost or an August fire or a flood in March. And enough people had lost years, enough people had given up and gone back east, that the ones who stayed had gotten superstitious about it. Superstitious in a quiet way, mostly. In the way of people who go to church regular, but also salt their doorsteps and don't plant on certain days, and have opinions about which families carry luck and which carry something else. Nobody would have said they believed in witchcraft. They'd have looked at you sideways if you'd suggested it. But the belief lived under the surface the way water lives under dry ground. It's there. You can get to it if you dig. And when there's enough pressure, it finds its own way up. Nora Voss had moved to the valley 3 years before I pulled her down from that tree. She'd come from Oregon City. A widow, her husband had died in a mining accident in the Idaho Territory, and she'd taken up a small piece of ground just east of Dalton, 4 acres and a cabin, and she kept a kitchen garden and sold herbs and remedies to whoever needed them, and that was how she lived. The herbs were the thing, I think, the thing that started it. She knew plants. She knew them the way some people know, whether not from books but from paying attention over a long time to the way things actually work, the connection between a root and the problem it addressed, and the right way to prepare it, and the right amount. She knew which things lowered fever. She knew a poultice that drew infection out of a wound better than anything the doctor in Dalton had in his bag, and the doctor in Dalton had a reasonable bag. She knew what helped a woman through a difficult birth, and what helped the sleep that wouldn't come, and what you gave a man whose joints ached so bad in the winter he couldn't make a fist. People came to her, and she helped them, and they paid her what they had, and she said thank you, and didn't make a fuss about any of it. That lasted about a year before the trouble started. A child in the valley died, a boy 8 years old, the youngest of the Packard family. Fever, the bad kind, the kind that takes you fast. His mother had tried everything, including Nora's remedies, before the boy died, and the mother in her grief had turned the story so that Nora's remedy had hastened the death. That's not what happened. The doctor's own account said the boy was past saving by the time anyone knew how sick he was. The fever had been in him 3 days before anyone noticed, and by the time he showed symptoms bad enough to treat, there was nothing left to do. But grief doesn't care much about accurate accounting. Grief needs somewhere to put itself. It found Nora. Word moved. The way word moves in a small valley is faster and more thorough than the mail. By the time it had made 2 or 3 full circuits, the story had grown. There were women who'd lost crops that season and connected it to Nora in ways they couldn't have fully explained but felt with conviction. There was a family whose horse had gone lame, and somehow Nora's name attached to that too. There was a man who'd had a bad run of luck all summer, 3 things going wrong in a row, and in a bad year 3 things going wrong in a row can start to feel like intention. Her garden was pulled up in July. She replanted. Her windows were broken in August. She replaced the glass herself, rode to Dalton and back with the panes wrapped in her coat. In September, someone painted a word on her fence, same word as the sign on the tree. She told a neighbor about the fence. The neighbor, a woman she'd thought was on friendly terms with, told her maybe she ought to think about whether she was welcome here. Nora told the neighbor she'd paid for her land same as anyone, and she wasn't leaving it. The night they took her, there were 8 of them. She fought. That's the 3 lines on her cheekbone. She fought them hard enough that there were marks on more than just her face, and she'd made noise enough that someone should have heard, except the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile and the wind was wrong. They dragged her to the lightning tree and they left her there. That's the valley's story. Now I'll go back to telling mine. She stayed in camp 3 days. The first full day she slept most of. The second day she was up before I was, and I found her standing outside the cook's tent in the gray morning light watching Grant and Sherman eat their grain. She had color back in her face. She'd found something to do with her hair, pulled it back and pinned it with 2 sticks she must have picked off the ground, and she stood with her arms crossed not against cold but because that was how she stood when she was thinking. I saw that right away. The crossed arms weren't a closed posture. They were a thinking posture. I walked past her toward the coffee and she said, without turning, "That big gray one favors his left front." I stopped, "Has for 2 years, can't find the problem." She turned then. In daylight I could see her more clearly than I had in the firelight the night before. She was maybe 35, dark-eyed, a face that had been exposed to weather and didn't apologize for it. The marks on her cheekbone were purpling toward their full color. "Can I look at him?" she said. I said she could. She went to Grant and ran her hands down his left leg in a way I recognized, slow, thorough, the way I'd watched a good farrier work, starting above the knee and moving down in sections. She lifted the hoof, looked at it, pressed along the frog with her thumbs, then worked back up to the knee, and she found something there, a knot of scar tissue behind the joint. Something I'd felt myself more than once but put down to the ordinary accumulated damage of a large horse. She pressed on it in a particular way and Grant threw his head but didn't pull, and she talked to him in a low voice the whole time, nothing I could make out, just the sound of it. He settled. She said, "There's a man in town, Hendricks, runs the livery. He knows this kind of injury. Tell him where the scar tissue is, describe where you're seeing the favor, and he'll know the treatment. It'll take time, but the leg's not ruined." "Hendricks hates me," I said. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite a smile. "Does he hate the horse?" I thought about it, probably not. "Then ask him about the horse." I went to get the coffee. When I came back with 2 cups, she took hers without comment, like it was the natural thing, like she'd been taking coffee from me every morning for years. We stood there watching Grant and Sherman for a while. "What do you do," I said, "with the herbs?" "Make things," she said. "Remedies, medicines, though some people don't want to call them that." "Why not?" "Because if they're medicines, a woman shouldn't know how to make them. That's doctor's business." She drank her coffee. "If they're just old-fashioned remedies a woman can know, it's less threatening that way." I looked at her. "Is that why they went after you, the herbs?" "That was the excuse," she said. "The boy dying was the excuse. The truth is I'd been outside of what they were comfortable with for a while. The herbs just gave it somewhere to land." She said it plainly with a clarity that surprised me. Not bitterness, just assessment. I thought about that for the rest of the morning. The 3rd day she came, and found me at the sawpit in the afternoon. 2 of the men were working the pit saw, taking a log down to planks, and the sound was considerable. She waited until they stopped to rest, and then she walked over to where I was standing and said, "I'm going back to my place tomorrow morning." I looked at her. The bruising on her face had gone the full ugly color by now, yellow-green at the edges. "You sure that's wise?" "Probably not," she said. "But it's my land and my cabin and my workroom, and they pulled my garden and I need to put it right before the ground freezes." If I wait much longer, I'll lose the bulbs. They might try again. They might, she agreed. But I'm not going to sit in a logging camp waiting to find out. That's not how I live. I knew she was right about all of it. It didn't make me feel better about it. I said, I have business in Dalton next week. All right. I'll ride by your place on the way, just to check. She looked at me for a moment. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Hale. You pulled me down from that tree in the rain. That's more than most people would have done, more than anyone did. I know I don't owe you, I said. I didn't say I owed you. She held my gaze for a little longer than was comfortable, not confrontationally, more like she was checking something. All right, she said. I'll bring Patrick along. He's the one who'd notice if something was wrong with your horse. Patrick was the youngest man in my crew, 22, had some knowledge of animals. He also had absolutely nothing to do with why I wanted to ride by her place, but he made a useful cover for the story I was telling myself. Nora almost smiled. All right, she said again. The morning she left was clear and cold, first frost on the ground, the grass white and stiff at the edge of camp. She had her horse, they'd left her horse. She'd found it tied to a tree half a mile from her cabin when they'd taken her, which told you something about how organized they were, or weren't. Foss had given her a bundle of food for the road, and she'd said something to him that made him look down and clear his throat, which from Foss was equivalent to a full emotional display. She stopped her horse at the edge of camp and looked back at me. Thank you, Mr. Hale, she said. Emmett, I said, I don't know why it just came out. She nodded, Emmett. Then she rode. I stood there longer than I needed to. I did have business in Dalton the next week. I also had it the week after that, and the week after that, and by the third week the business was getting somewhat thin as a pretext. I'd find something, a specific bolt I needed, a question for the man at the feed store that had a shorter answer than I'd hoped, a letter to post that could have gone the other direction to the mail rider just as easily. The important thing was the reason to ride the 4 miles out of my way to her place. She was always working when I arrived. I never once came and found her idle. In the garden, on her knees with dirt on her hands and her sleeves pushed back, working the rows with a focus that had something almost aggressive in it. You pulled this up. I am putting it back, every stem of it. Or inside at her work table with her jars and her dried things and a small knife she used with the precision of a man who knows his tools. She told me what things were if I asked. I started asking. A root that came from 3 counties east, dried and powdered, which she put in a small dose into a tea for people whose joints ached bad in the cold. She described the mechanism with more knowledge than I expected, something about the way the inflammation worked, and why the compound in the root interfered with it, and she'd learned this from a medical text. She said, a German one she'd had translated for her piece by a woman in Portland who'd studied in Europe. A gray-green lichen she harvested off north-facing rock faces that when prepared correctly closed a wound in a day that would otherwise have taken 4. A plant she called by its Latin name, and also by a Chinook word she'd learned from an older woman who'd lived in the valley before the settlement came, who'd shown Nora the plant and its uses in exchange for Nora helping her through a winter sickness. She gave me more than I gave her, Nora said, by a long way. How so? She gave me years of knowledge. I gave her 3 weeks of company and some soup. She was quiet a moment. She died the next spring. Her name was Yakama. I never knew if that was her whole name or just the part she gave me. She went back to the route she was preparing. I watched her hands, quick and sure, unhesitating. Why did you stay in the valley? I said, after the trouble started. She looked up. Because the alternative is they win. That's it. That's most of it. She set down the knife. And because the women who come to me need what I have, they need it. I'm not the only person who can make a red clover tincture or dry comfrey, but I'm the only one in this valley who does, and the valley is what we have. If I go, they go without. I'm not willing to do that to them. I thought about what it took to hold that position, what it cost. She'd held it with broken windows and a ruined garden and a tree in the rain. She'd held it the same way she stood with her arms crossed, not closed, just thinking. She fed me dinner those visits, after the first couple. Nothing elaborate, beans and bread, or whatever was in the pot, but she cooked with the same attention she brought to everything, and the food was better than it had any right to be given what she was working with. I sat across her table and we talked about the valley or the work or things we'd read or remembered, and the evenings passed, and I rode back to camp in the dark with something unfamiliar happening inside me that I was doing my best not to examine directly. The feeling, when I finally admitted it to myself, was something like, I want to come back, plain as that. I want to come back, not to tell her anything or do anything or get anything. Just to be in that room with her for another couple hours, with the lamp on and the fire going and her hands moving over whatever she was working on. I hadn't felt that one in 6 years. It scared me, if I'm being honest. Not her, she scared me some, but the way that something that matters scares you, not the way danger scares you. What scared me more was my own want. The fact that I still had it. I'd thought that part of me had closed off and I'd made a kind of peace with the closing, and now here it was, apparently not closed at all, just waiting, and I wasn't sure I knew what to do with that. Somewhere in November, I went to Dalton for a different reason. I was at the supply house settling that month's account, and I ran into Martin Packard, the father of the boy who died. He was a big man, broader than me, red in the face in the specific way of a man who's been drinking since mid-morning. He'd seen me through the window and come in, and I knew from his face that he'd come in to say something. He said some things about Nora. I won't repeat all of it. Some of it was grief talking, real and awful grief that had gone rancid because he didn't know what to do with it. Some of it was something meaner than grief. He said she was getting what she deserved, and he said it'd be smart of me to stop riding out to her place, and he said the valley had people's backs when they needed it, meaning his people, meaning not her. I let him get through it. Then I said, "You know what happened to your boy wasn't her doing." He got very still. I said, "The doctor told you." The boy was 3 days sick before anyone saw it. He was gone before she ever gave him anything. You know that, Martin. His jaw worked. You don't know what you're talking about. I know what Curtis said. Curtis was the doctor, because I went and asked him. Because when I pull a woman down from a tree and she tells me what's been happening, I tend to want to know if it's accurate. It was accurate. "Get out of my way, Hale." "I'll get out of your way," I said. "But I'm going to keep riding out there. And if anyone touches her again, her property, her person, anything, I'm going to come into this town and make a full account of everything that's happened since July with names, and I'll take it to Curtis, and I'll take it to the county sheriff if I have to. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just explaining what will happen." I stood back. He looked at me for a long time. He was trying to decide whether I meant it. I meant it. He went past me without another word. I stood there a minute. My hands were steady. I'm not a man who gets worked up in confrontations. I go very still when I'm angry, which some people find more unnerving than shouting. But there was something happening in my chest that wasn't quite anger. More like, I meant what I said, the truth of it. I would go to the sheriff. I would put every name to paper. I didn't care what it cost me in the valley. That was new information about myself. I should tell you something about what it's like to be a man like me. I'm not saying it for sympathy. I'm saying it because it's relevant to understanding the rest of this, and I don't know how to tell the rest without it. I've always been large, larger than most rooms felt designed for, larger than most social situations, larger than the job required, but the job took what I had. By the time I was in my 20s, I'd figured out that my size was useful in timber work and in keeping order among men, and I'd leaned into that. And over time, I'd become mostly the thing I'd leaned into. Not because I wanted to. You don't decide to become the big, quiet, hard man. You just stop resisting it because resisting it costs more than going along. People expect it. They move around you accordingly. You learn to fit yourself to what they expect. After Ruth died, that hardening finished itself. I don't mean I became cruel or mean. I mean I became settled in the wrong way, like a river after a flood that finds a new channel and then stays in it, even when the flood's been gone for years. I was in the channel of the hard man alone, past hoping for much. And I'd been in it long enough that I'd stopped noticing it was a channel and thought it was just the landscape. Part of what happened with Nora, part of what she did, without setting out to do it, without, I think, fully knowing she was doing it, is that she looked at me and did not see the channel. She saw what was running in it. She saw the actual water, not the banks. She looked at me the way I'd learned to look at timber. At what's actually there, not the shape of it, not the bark and the outer rings, but the grain inside, what the tree is made of. I started asking Nora more questions. I don't know exactly when it became a thing, the questions. I'm not a conversationalist by nature. My crew would tell you I could go a full workday without saying more than was required. But with her, I found things I wanted to know, and I found I was willing to ask them, which is two separate thresholds. I asked her about her husband. She talked about him plainly, without drama. He'd been a good man, she said, practical and kind, and they'd been compatible in the ways that matter, and she'd missed him. She didn't make him into a saint. She said he'd had a temper in the mornings until he'd had his coffee, and that he was congenitally unable to hang anything straight, and that he'd never once been on time to anything in their 4 years together, and she smiled when she said it. It was the smile of someone who can afford to be honest about what they've lost because the love itself is not in question. I asked her about Oregon City, where she'd come from. She described the place. A river town, she said, older than most things out here, more settled, the kind of settled that can tip into settled opinions about everything. She'd left it because her husband's death had left her without anchor there, and she'd wanted somewhere she could start from the beginning. Did you think it would be this hard? I said. Starting over. Coming here, the valley. She thought about it. I thought it would be hard in the obvious ways. Cold winters, hard ground, neighbors who didn't know me yet. I didn't think the opposition would be so, she paused, looking for the word. Organized. People who are superstitious on their own are manageable. People who organize around it are something else. Why didn't you leave when it started? I told you, because they win if I go. That's a principle, I said. Principles are hard to live on when someone's throwing burning rags at your wall. She looked at me quickly. I'd known about the fire, she'd told me, but I hadn't said it that plainly before. I know what it's hard to live on, she said quietly. I also know that I am what I am, and what I am knows things that matter to the women in this valley, and I am not going to let 8 men with a rope decide that I don't belong here. She said it with absolute steadiness, not raised voice, not shaking hands. The same voice she'd used the first night in the cook tent, when she'd said there was no one to send word to, just stating facts. I looked at her across the table. No, I said, you're not. We ate the rest of the meal without saying much, and it was comfortable, which meant something. She came to camp in December. It was deep winter by then, snow from Thanksgiving on, and she came on horseback with a pack across her saddle, and I watched her ride in from the edge of the trees and felt my heart do something embarrassing. Something it hadn't done in so long I'd almost forgotten it was capable of it. She sat her horse straight and easy, and she had her coat buttoned to the chin, and her breath was visible in the cold, and she looked, from where I was standing, like the most specific and particular person I'd ever seen. That's the only way I can say it. Not beautiful in any general sense, though she was that too, but specific, exactly herself, nobody else. She said she had provisions for the camp. Tea things, some medicinal supplies, dried meat she'd got from a family upriver. She said young Petrick had come to her place 2 weeks back with a deep cut on his forearm from a saw. He'd been embarrassed to come to me about it, she said, and she treated it, but she wanted to leave supplies in case it happened again before she could get out. That was what she said. The men received her in the way good rough men receive a good woman they've been hoping will come back. They were careful with themselves. They said ma'am. Foss, who I'd not seen show social anxiety in 4 years of working together, straightened his hair with the flat of his palm when she walked into the cook tent. She and Foss cooked together that evening. I have no idea what they talked about. I was at the far end of camp pretending to do something necessary, but I heard them once and they were laughing. Foss had a laugh like a large dog barking, and it was not a sound you heard often. The meal was excellent. Afterward the men sat around the fire longer than usual, not wanting to go to their tents, just sitting in the warmth of a camp that felt different than it had this morning. I thought about how long it had been since camp felt like that. The second night, after the men had gone to their tents and Foss had banked the stove, we sat outside by the fire ring. It was clear, very cold, stars like broken glass above the tree line. She had a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of the tea she'd brought, one of her own preparations, something that smelled of pine and something else, something I couldn't name. She was looking at the sky. I was looking at her. After a while she said, "My husband used to say that every man dies with his story unfinished." I said, "What did he mean by that?" "That there's always more you meant to do, more you meant to say." She paused. He said it like it was a comfort, like the story keeps going even when you don't. The part you were part of keeps going. I thought about Ruth, about the room I kept closed. "I think about that," I said. "Whether I waited too long on things, whether I put things off until there wasn't time." She looked at me. Not with pity, she didn't seem to do pity, with attention. "Have you?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Ask me in a few years and I might have a better answer." She held that, turned back to the stars. "My mother used to say that you wait until you're sure and you'll wait your whole life. She married my father in 3 weeks. Were they happy?" "For a long time, for most of their lives." She drank her tea. "They argued about everything, but they were happy." The fire had gone mostly to coals. I could feel the cold on my face and the warmth from the coals on my hands, and I was very aware of her 6 inches away from me, looking at the sky, and of everything I was not saying. "Nora." "Yes, Emmett." She'd used my given name twice now. The first time a few weeks back, and I'd held on to it in a way that was probably not entirely adult. I said, "I'm going to say something, and if I've misread the situation you can tell me, and I'll let it alone." "All right. I'd like to keep seeing you, not just riding by on the way to Dalton, intentionally, because I want to." I stopped. I'm aware I haven't said this with any particular grace. She was quiet for a moment, then quietly, "You said it plainly, which is what it deserved." "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes. And then, it's been a yes for about a month if you want the full account." I looked at the coals. I felt foolish and glad at the same time, which I understand is the ordinary way of things, but it was not ordinary for me. It had been a long time since I'd felt both at once. "I'm not good at this," I said. "I was bad at it when I was young and I am probably worse now." "You cut me down from a tree," she said. "In the rain, without knowing a thing about me. That's the information I needed." I looked at her. "I'm not saying that to flatter you," she said. "I mean it literally. That told me what I needed to know." I reached over and took her hand, which was cold. She turned her palm up and held mine. We stayed there until the coals were gray. "Winter." I learned her in winter, and it is not the worst season to learn someone. The cold makes you honest. There's less between you and the actual facts of things. And the evenings are long, and you find out whether you can sit beside a person when there's no particular reason, except that you want to. We were easy with each other. That was the thing that surprised me most, not just that we were easy, but how fast it came. I have never been easy with people, ask my crew. I'm a man of silences and careful distance, and I had assumed that was simply what I was, the nature of the grain. But with Nora, the silences were comfortable. She had no anxiety about them, no impulse to fill them, and so I didn't have to manage her comfort about the fact that I was quiet. She just sat with it. I could think out loud or not, and either was fine. She had opinions, strong ones given without performance. We argued about small things with a pleasure I hadn't had in years. Whether Foss's biscuits needed more fat, she was right. They did. The best way to winter a horse, whether a man I knew was fundamentally good-hearted or only good-hearted when things went his way. We argued and neither of us sulked, and when one of us was wrong we said so, and that was the end of it. She trusted me with her knowledge. I've thought about why that mattered as much as it did. She'd been careful for 3 years about what she shared and with whom, for good reason, given the valley, and with me she stopped being careful. She showed me things in her workroom, explained what they did and why. She let me ask questions without treating the questions as challenges. She'd say, "Here's the honest answer to that," and then she'd give it. Once I said, "Does it bother you, teaching me things you've had people hate you for knowing?" She thought about it. "No," she said, "you're curious without being frightened, that's rare." "What's to be frightened of?" She gave me a look that said, "You know very well what," but she was smiling when she said it. There was one afternoon in November, a Thursday. I remember the day because I'd given the crew Thursday afternoons off through the dark of winter when the light went early and the work got slow, that I arrived at her place, and she was not in the garden and not in the cabin. I stood outside for a moment, then walked around to the back, and found her up in the hillside above the property, on the north-facing slope where the trees thinned. She was kneeling in the snow looking at something on the bark of a rock face, her nose about 2 inches from the stone. I came up beside her. "What is it?" "Gray lungwort," she said. "There's a good colony here. I found it in October, but I wanted to see it in the cold, see if it's still viable." It looked like lichen, dull and flat against the rock. "Is it?" "Yes." She stood, brushing snow off her knees. "It's one of the ones I use on infected wounds. There's been some German work lately, medical papers, suggesting why it works. Something in the tissue structure." She looked at the lichen. "Yakama called it old man's breath, because of the way it looks." I looked at it. It did look like that. "Does it need to be winter to harvest?" "No, but I like to check them in winter, see which colonies made it." She started down the hill. "The ones that make it through here are worth more. They've proved something." I followed her down. The snow was a foot deep off the path, and we broke through the crust with every step. At the bottom she stopped and looked back up at the hill, at the dark line of trees against the white, and her face had that particular expression, the one that meant she was taking an account of something and was satisfied with what she found. "My father used to say the woods are the only thing that's honest," I said. "He meant the tree doesn't pretend to be anything. It's what it is." She looked at me. "He was a logger." 30 years. "Is that why you do it?" I thought about it. I'd never been asked that or hadn't stopped to answer it. Partly. And because I'm built for heavy work. And because there's something in it, the choosing which trees where to cut first, that takes a kind of attention I like. "What kind?" "Quiet attention," I said. "You can't rush it. The tree doesn't care if you rush." She smiled. "No." We went back to her cabin. She made tea. I sat at her table and she sat across from me, and we talked about her father in Tillamook and my father in the Oregon Valley where I'd grown up. And it was easy in the way things are easy when you're not trying for anything. When you've stopped pretending the reason you're there is the business in Dalton or the question for the feed store. I was there because I wanted to be there. That's simple. It had taken me 8 weeks to admit it and about 8 minutes to tell her, and since then I'd stopped inventing reasons. There was another evening, closer to Christmas, when I arrived late. I'd had a problem with a fell that went wrong, a tree that twisted as it came down and took out 40 feet of smaller timber it shouldn't have, and we'd spent 3 extra hours cleaning it up, and the mood in camp was bad. I rode to her place still carrying the frustration of it, the specific frustration of a mistake you made through impatience, a decision you knew was slightly off and made anyway. She saw it when I came in. She didn't ask. She put a plate in front of me and sat down and waited. After a while, I told her about it. The tree, the mistake, the look on the faces of the men after. She said, "Was anyone hurt?" "No. That's the most important thing." I know, I pushed the plate back, but I knew better. I rushed the assessment, and I knew I was rushing it, and I did it anyway because I wanted to get out of the cold. "So you'll be more careful next time." That's not a very satisfying answer. "No," she said, "but it's the right one." She refilled my coffee. We sat there for a long time after that without talking much, and by the time I rode back to camp the weight of the day had gone down to a manageable size. I've thought since about what she did there, or didn't do. She didn't tell me it was fine, didn't argue me out of feeling bad about it, didn't make it into something smaller than it was. She just sat with me in it until it was done. That's a skill, harder than it looks. I went to Hendricks about Grant. I swallowed what I felt about Hendricks, which was mutual and long-standing, and had to do with a land dispute 4 years back that neither of us would fully admit was resolved, and I described the scar tissue and the favor, and Hendricks listened with his arms crossed and said, "Yeah, I know that." He gave me a treatment. It took 3 months, twice a week, and Grant came right. I told Nora and she nodded like she'd known he would, which she had, which I found disproportionately satisfying. In February, a man named Ord threw burning rags against the wall of Nora's cabin. She was asleep when it started. She smelled the smoke before she heard anything, and when she got outside the woodpile was burning hard and the rags were still smoking against the stone wall, and she spent 40 minutes moving snow onto the woodpile with the coal shovel before the fire was out. The wall didn't catch, stone doesn't burn, but she lost about a third of the woodpile, and her hands were cold enough by the end that she couldn't properly close them. She came to me in the morning. I looked at her hands. She let me look. "You know who it was," I said. "I saw him riding away." "Ord. His horse is distinctive." "I got my coat," she said. "Emmett." I looked at her. "Don't do anything that gets you in trouble," she said. "I need you not in trouble." That was the first time she'd said she needed me for anything. I don't think she knew what it did to me. I don't think I showed it. I said, "I'm going to Dalton to make a formal account to the sheriff's man. That's all." "All right," she said. I went to Dalton. I found the deputy. The sheriff himself was 40 miles south, but Curtis, the deputy, had sense. I made a full account. The garden in July, the windows in August, the fence in September, the tree in October, what I'd witnessed myself, what Nora had told me, the names I had. The fire in February and Ord's distinctive horse. Curtis wrote all of it down. He looked at me when I was done. "You understand this is going to make some people angry." "I understand that," I said. "I'd rather they be angry at me than burning her woodpile." He sent for the sheriff that week. The sheriff came in March and made visits. He talked to people. He talked to Ord directly and to Martin Packard and to several others whose names were on my account. I don't know exactly what was said. I know there were no more incidents after that. I know the women who'd been afraid to go to Nora started going again, quietly, through the back way, and she helped them. I know that one of the women who'd been part of the group in October came to Nora's cabin in April and stood at the door for a long time before knocking. Nora told me about it. The woman had a daughter who was sick. Nora let her in, treated the daughter, charged her less than she should have. I said, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Let her in after." Nora looked at me for a moment. "The daughter didn't tie me to a tree," she said, "and the mother is ashamed. Shame is its own punishment. I'm not interested in adding to it." She said it without saintliness, just facts. Spring came and the valley thawed and the women came, and Nora's garden came back full. The bulbs she'd put in before the freeze came up in April, crocus first, which was just color, just a sign. Then the medicinal things she'd planted in the rows she'd redug in October after they'd been pulled. I was there one morning when she walked the rows and looked at what had come up, and the look on her face was not triumph, not relief, just satisfaction. The deep, quiet satisfaction of a person who did a thing because it was right to do, and the thing worked out. I said, "Did you know they'd come back?" "The bulbs, I hoped. The soil here is good if you amend it right." "I meant, did you know you'd come back, after October?" She looked at me. "I was going to come back regardless," she said. "That was never the question." "What was the question?" "Whether it would cost more than I had." She turned back to the rows. It turned out I had more than I thought. I stayed to help her with the heavy digging that afternoon. I am not a gardener, I am a man who fells trees, which is almost the opposite of gardening. But she put a spade in my hand and told me where to dig, and I dug there, and she worked alongside me, and we got the new beds turned before the light went. She had dirt on her face by the end from pushing her hair back with her hands, and she didn't bother with it, just kept working. That was the spring. Then it was summer and we married, and I knew by then that I was going to remember the whole year as one thing: the tree in October, the rain, the rope, the sound she'd been making that stopped me on the road, and then the careful accretion of everything after, the coffee and the cold, the evenings at her table, the fire ring and the stars, all of it leading to this, the garden in spring and her face in the afternoon light. It's strange, the way a life turns. I've been in the timber long enough to know that a tree's whole shape comes from one or two moments. The lean it took after a hard frost 20 years back, the branch that broke in a storm and made it compensate to the left. You look at the shape of the tree, and if you know how to look you can read the history in it. But you usually can't read it from inside. You have to step back, and that takes time. I'm old enough now to step back some. And what I can see is that the shape of my life turned on a road in October 1889, in the rain when I stopped the horse. That one moment, everything else came from that. I should tell you about a conversation I had with one of my men. His name was Dyer. He'd been with me 4 years, solid timber man, not given to talk, not given to anything that wasn't necessary. We were two of a kind that way. One morning in the spring he was sharpening a blade and I walked past him and he said, without looking up, "You're different." I stopped. "How so?" "Lighter." He ran the file along the blade. "You were about twice as heavy to be around last fall as you are now." "No offense." I thought about that. "I know," I said. "She's good," he said, meaning Nora, and went back to his work. That was the whole conversation. But I went back to it a lot after. Lighter. It was accurate. I'd been carrying something for a long time that I'd thought was just my own weight, the specific gravity of who I was, and it turned out it wasn't. It was the weight of being alone in a particular way, not without people around. I'd had 18 men around me for years, but alone in the sense that no one was paying specific attention to me. No one was particularly interested in whether I was all right. She was interested. She would ask me things not the way people ask questions they're waiting out, running down the clock until they can talk about themselves, but with actual interest, actual attention. She wanted to know what I thought. She'd look at my face when something was bothering me and say, "What's that?" and wait for the answer, not to fix it, not to advise, just because she wanted to know what was in my mind. I found myself talking about things I'd had no words for, about the work, about the weight of deciding which trees came down, about Ruth, finally, the room I'd kept shut. I opened that door with her slowly over several evenings, and she listened, and she didn't try to fill it with her own story or dismiss what I was feeling or tell me it had been 6 years and it was time. She let it be what it was. Toward the end of one of those evenings she said, "You were a good husband to her." I wasn't always. No one always is. She looked at me across the table. But you loved her well, I can hear it. I thought about that for a long time. It felt true. It also felt like permission for something, though I couldn't have said what. We married in June. Small thing, the preacher in Dalton, Nora's neighbor who'd stood by her through the worst of it, Foss and 3 of my men. That was the whole party. Nora wore a blue dress she'd made herself over the winter, let out at the sleeves, and she looked exactly like herself, which is to say she looked better than anything I'd seen in years. After, Foss cooked a meal back at camp and the men toasted us with the good whiskey I'd been keeping since Christmas, saving it without knowing exactly what for. Grant and Sherman were turned out in the upper meadow, and the evening light was long and gold on the grass, and Nora stood beside me and looked at the horses and then looked at me, and I thought, this is what I was waiting for, not knowing I was waiting, not knowing there was anything left to wait for. She moved her things to my cabin 1/2 mile from camp, 2 solid rooms, a stove, a view of the mountains in the east. She'd been telling me for 3 months what needed doing to it, which was not wrong. We spent the first weeks of summer fixing what needed fixing. I did the heavy work and she did the detailed work, and between us, we got the windows right, and the floor sound, and the eaves cleared of the needles and rot. For her workroom, I built off the back of the cabin. Tongue-and-groove walls for the damp, shelves I fitted to her specifications. She was particular about the depth and spacing, and I built to what she asked, which is how I approach specifications in general. You trust the person who knows what the work requires. I put in a south-facing window, wide, so she'd have light for growing things through the winter. The roof I doubled because that north corner caught more snow than the rest. 3 weekends, I was proud of it. She stood in the doorway of the finished room and looked at it for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "Emmett." "Yeah." She looked at me, the full account look, the one I'd seen the first time in the cook tent when she was deciding if she could trust me, and every time since when she was seeing something about me she wanted to be sure of. "Come here," she said. I went to her, and she put her arms around me and held on, her face against my chest, and I put my arms around her and held on back. That's the whole picture. I don't know how to add to it. I'll tell you the thing about myth, because it comes to mind. There was a man in the valley, I won't name him, who'd been there from the earliest days of the settlement, one of the founding generation. By the late 80s, he was a kind of legend in the valley. People talked about him the way people talk about symbols. He'd been there longest, he'd survived the hardest winters, he'd made it work when others had given up. All of that was true. But something had happened over time, where the legend of him had gotten so large and so fixed that the man inside it had gone quiet. People didn't see the man anymore. They saw the symbol. And the man, I'd known him some, had started to become the symbol, had started to talk like the stories people told about him. Had stopped somewhere along the way, simply being a person. I thought about that when Nora said, "People do that to themselves. They decide what they are and they stop becoming." I'd said something about that man, wondering out loud. She'd been quiet a moment and then said it. I asked what she meant. She said, "You become the story people tell about you if you let them. You stop being something that grows. You're just fixed." I thought about the sign on the tree, which, one word, cedar shake, iron nail, a whole person hammered down to a word and nailed there in the rain. She hadn't let them do it. She'd stayed herself the whole way through, when they pulled the garden, when they broke the windows, when they tied her up. She'd stayed Nora Voss, the woman who knew what plants did, who let a grieving woman in when she came knocking, who went back the next morning to put the garden right before the frost. Nothing fixed, nothing removed. She'd stayed growing. I'd been in my own danger of that, not of someone else's story being nailed to me, but of my own. The story I'd been telling myself for 6 years, hard man, alone, past the part of life where softness was possible, past the kind of hope that leads to loss. I'd gotten comfortable in that story. I'd stopped noticing it was a story. She looked at me and saw past it. She looked at the full of me, the hands, the silences, the weight of the work, the closed room, and she chose it. Not the simplified version, not the legend of the hard timber man. The actual man with all the actual things in him. You don't owe me a thing, Mr. Hale. You already cut me down. But it went both ways. She cut me down too, from the thing I'd stranded myself in. And the fact that she did it freely, not because she had to, not out of debt or obligation or any shortage of other options, that's what gives it the weight it has. A gift is only a gift when it's freely given. She gave it freely. This is the last thing. There's a morning I come back to years after. Late October, year after we married, first frost of the season. I came outside early before full light, that blue cold hour, and she was already up. She was standing at the edge of the property looking east toward the mountains, a coat over her nightgown, her hair loose, a cup of something warm in both hands. Her breath and the steam from the cup going up together in the still air. I stood in the doorway watching her. She hadn't heard me come out. She was just there looking at the mountains with that complete attention she gave to things she thought were worth attention. I'd seen her look at a plant that way, a wound, a sky, a person she was deciding about. After a while she said, without turning, "Come see this." I went and stood beside her. The light had found the mountain peaks before it reached us, and the snow up there had gone pink and gold, while everything in the valley was still gray. The river was a thread of silver between dark trees. One bird calling somewhere far in the timber, one bird, and then the quiet around it, which was complete. She put her arm through mine. We stood there without talking. The light came down slowly, the way it does in October, taking its time. First the high ground above the tree line, then the upper slopes, then the color coming into the trees themselves, the larch going gold, the firs holding their green. When the light reached us, she turned her head and looked at me for a moment. Just looked. Nothing particular in it, just looking, the way you look at something you're glad is there. Then she turned back to the mountains. I thought, all right, the only word I had for it, all right. That's what I come back to when I think about what my life turned out to be. Not the timber, not the years of work, not the things I built or survived or managed to hold together through the hard seasons. This moment. This woman with her arm through mine. The mountains going gold. And the understanding, the one I'd come to too slowly with Ruth, the one I'd been carrying around in a closed room for 6 years, that the story keeps going even when you think it's done. That there can be another chapter, and another morning, and another person who looks at you like you're specifically the one she came here to find. She chose me. With everything she knew, she chose me. That's the whole of it. All right.